Some works of art are beautiful, some are challenging, and some are simply unforgettable, searing themselves into your memory. This is one of those. It's one of the most famous and most controversial paintings by the legendary Frida Kahlo. It depicts in brutal, unflinching detail the final moments of a woman's life as she falls to her death. But this isn't just a morbid fantasy. It's a memorial, a tribute to a real woman commissioned by her best friend. The woman in the painting was named Dorothy Hale. She was a celebrated socialite, a fashion icon, once named the most beautiful woman in America. She lived a life of seemingly effortless glamour, surrounded by wealth, power, and famous friends. So how did this dazzling star of high society end up as the subject of this horrific masterpiece? What could drive a woman who seemingly had everything to step out of her penthouse window, wearing her favorite black velvet dress and a corsage of yellow roses? This is the story of a life lived on the brink, a story of ambition, heartbreak, and the terrifying fragility of a world built on illusion. It's the story of Dorothy Hale and the powerful, famous friend whose final act of remembrance would become a scandal in itself. To understand Dorothy Hale, you must first understand the world that created her. She came of age in the Roaring Twenties, an era of explosive energy and dizzying social change. It was the age of the flapper, of jazz, of speakeasies and fortunes made overnight on the stock market. For a beautiful young woman with ambition, New York City was a stage, and the ultimate prize was a life of security and status. But this glittering world rested on a fragile foundation. The role of the socialite was, for many women without their own inheritance, a precarious and demanding profession. It required constant performance, wearing the right clothes, attending the right parties, and most importantly, attracting and keeping a wealthy, powerful man. Then came the crash of 1929, plunging America into the Great Depression. The music faded, the fortunes vanished, and the glittering facade of the jazz age cracked. Suddenly, the precariousness of a life built on appearances became terrifyingly real. It was a world of immense pressure where one misstep, one tragedy, could send you plummeting from the penthouse to the pavement. Dorothy Hale was about to learn that lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. Her story begins not in the grand salons of Park Avenue, but in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Born Dorothy Donovan in 1905, she was a pretty, ambitious girl who dreamed of a life far beyond her middle-class beginnings. After a brief stint in a convent school, she followed the path of so many other dreamers and headed for New York to make it on stage. With her classic beauty and elegant poise, she quickly landed a coveted spot in the chorus line of the legendary Ziegfeld Follies. Being a Ziegfeld girl was more than just a job. It was an entry ticket into a whole new world. These women were icons of beauty and glamour, admired and pursued by the city's most powerful men. It was here that Dorothy honed her ability to perform, to project an image of effortless sophistication. She was no longer just Dorothy Donovan. She was becoming a character, a beautiful socialite in the making. Her performance paid off. In 1927, she married Gardner Hale, a man who seemed to be the romantic hero of her dreams. Hale was a talented and handsome fresco painter, an artist, but also a man of means and impeccable social standing. He moved with ease through the highest circles of society on both sides of the Atlantic. For Dorothy, he was everything. He gave her a new name, a new life, and the security she had always craved. She wasn't just a wife. She was an essential part of the artistic and social brand they built together. Gardner provided the talent and the name, but Dorothy provided the exquisite taste and the social grace that turned their homes into celebrated salons. She wasn't merely present. She was the curator of their glamorous world. Their life together was a glamorous whirlwind. They lived between a luxurious apartment in New York and a beautiful estate in Connecticut, spending long periods in Europe, socializing with artists, writers, and aristocrats on the Italian coast. They held court at the Villa d'Este on Lake Como, their circle including luminaries like the famous jewelry designer Fulco di Verdura and the newspaper magnate Lord Beaverbrook. Dorothy, with her innate grace and style, blossomed in this environment. She was adored by her husband, admired by their friends, and celebrated for her beauty and charm. She had achieved the dream. She was living in the fairy tale. Her life was a carefully constructed work of art, and for 4 blissful years, it seemed that the paint would never dry, the beauty would never fade. But fairy tales can end in an instant. In December of 1931, while driving home in California, Gardner Hale's car veered off a cliff. He was killed instantly. At the age of 26, Dorothy Hale's perfect world was utterly destroyed. The tragedy was not just emotional, it was catastrophic in every sense. Gardner had been her entire world, her husband, her best friend, her financial provider, and the source of her social standing. Overnight, she lost it all. The shock of his death was soon followed by another colder shock, the state of his finances. Gardner had lived like a prince, but his estate was a tangled mess of debts. After everything was settled, the woman who had hosted Vanderbilt's was left with a pittance. She was left a widow with dwindling funds and no clear path forward. The Great Depression was raging, and the comfortable world she had known was evaporating. The curtain had come down on the first act of her life, and she was now alone on a dark and empty stage. The years that followed Gardner's death were a long, painful struggle to reclaim the life she had lost. She tried to restart her acting career, but success eluded her. She landed a few minor roles on Broadway and in Hollywood, but she was never a star. She appeared in a play called The Rise of Elmer Gantry and had a small, uncredited role in the film Catherine the Great, but the industry didn't know what to do with her. She was a society figure, not a working actress. The very glamour that made her famous in the society pages worked against her on the casting couch. She was known more for being a glamorous socialite than for being a serious actress, a reputation that proved impossible to shake. Without her husband's fortune, she became dependent on the generosity of her wealthy friends. She was a constant guest in the grand homes of others, living out of suitcases, a beautiful but tragic figure, moving through a world she no longer truly belonged to. This was the era of her great romantic pursuits, not for love, but for survival. She embarked on a series of affairs with powerful older men, hoping one would lead to the security of marriage. She was linked to the legendary financier Bernard Baruch and the brilliant sculptor Isamu Noguchi. But these men, while happy to be seen with the beautiful Dorothy Hale, were not looking for a wife. They became her patrons, funding her apartment and her wardrobe, but always keeping her at an arm's length from any real commitment. Each failed romance was another closed door, another turn of the screw on her mounting desperation. Her friends were among the most powerful people in America, including the influential publisher Clare Boothe Luce, who would become a central figure in Dorothy's life and ultimately her death. Clare was a woman forged in a different fire, a brilliant writer and fiercely ambitious social climber herself. She had secured her position through talent, wit, and a strategic marriage to the powerful Henry Luce. In Dorothy, Clare saw both a dear friend and a cautionary tale. She felt a genuine affection for her, but it was colored by a growing impatience with Dorothy's inability to solve her own problems. Their friendship was a complex web of support and judgment, of lavish generosity and blunt, often painful advice. Clare was the anchor, and Dorothy increasingly was the beautiful ship taking on water, drifting ever closer to the rocks. Dorothy's primary strategy for survival was to find another man to provide for her. She embarked on a series of high-profile affairs, hoping to find a new husband. Her lovers included powerful older figures, like the legendary financier Bernard Baruch and the influential Roosevelt advisor Harry Hopkins. These men could provide her with temporary security and a place in society, but none of them would marry her. To them, she was a beautiful ornament, a delightful companion who added a touch of tragic glamour to their dinner parties and weekends in the country. The arrangement was an unspoken contract, her beauty and charm in exchange for their patronage. They paid her bills, gifted her jewels, and most importantly, they gave her access. To be seen on the arm of Bernard Baruch was to be seen, to still exist in a world that had a very short memory. But this life was a tightrope walk over a canyon of humiliation. She was, in the cold reality of the situation, a kept woman entirely dependent on the whims of men who held all the power. Every smile was a performance, every charming anecdote a justification for her existence. She lived in a state of constant, gnawing anxiety, terrified of the day her looks would fade or her patron's interest would wane. She was a beautiful companion, a lovely dinner guest, but she was no longer a young, innocent debutante. She was a widow with financial problems, a woman haunted by a past tragedy. This made her, in the eyes of these pragmatic men, a romantic risk, not a suitable candidate to become a wife. One of her most significant and complex relationships during this time was with the acclaimed Japanese-American sculptor Isamu Noguchi. He was a brilliant, intense artist, a world away from the stuffy financiers she was also seeing. He operated in a bohemian world of studios, intellectual debate, and raw creativity. He was captivated by her beauty, but also by her profound sadness. He saw the cracks in her perfect facade and was drawn to the tragedy beneath. They began a passionate affair, a relationship that offered a glimpse of a completely different kind of life. With Noguchi, she wasn't just a socialite, she was a muse. He even created a famous sculpture of her, a sleek, stylized bust in pink Georgia marble that captured her elegant essence. In that sculpture, you can see how he viewed her as a perfect, remote, and ultimately tragic form. It's a masterpiece of observation, but it's also the act of an artist turning a person into an object of beauty. For a time, it seemed she might find a different kind of life with him, one based on art and genuine connection. They traveled to Mexico together, and for a moment it looked as if she might be able to escape the gilded cage of New York society. He offered her a world where her value wasn't tied to a bank account, but Dorothy was still chasing the security she had lost. The bohemian life of an artist, with its financial instability and lack of social status, terrified her. She saw it not as freedom, but as a step down. She wanted marriage, a name, and the protection that came with it. And Noguchi, a fiercely independent artist dedicated to his work, was not prepared to offer it. He loved her perhaps as a muse, but he could not or would not become her savior. The relationship fractured on this fundamental conflict. He offered her a life of passion and art, but she craved a life of stability and status. When she eventually realized he would never propose, the affair ended. The closing of that door was a particularly bitter blow. It wasn't just the loss of another man, it was the rejection of an alternate path, a tacit admission that she was unable to imagine a life for herself that wasn't defined by a wealthy husband. With that failure, her options narrowed, and her desperation grew ever deeper. By the autumn of 1938, Dorothy Hale was at the end of her rope. She was 33 years old. Her acting career was stalled, her affair with Bernard Baruch had ended, and she was deeply in debt. Her friends were growing weary of her constant financial troubles. Claire Booth Luce gave her $1,000, a huge sum at the time, and told her in no uncertain terms that she needed to find a job and stand on her own 2 feet. The charity she had depended on for so long was running out. Feeling abandoned and seeing no way out, Dorothy began to plan her final tragic performance. In the last weeks of her life, she started hosting a series of intimate farewell parties. She told her friends that she was planning to go on a long journey and wanted to say goodbye. No one understood what she truly meant. They saw a beautiful, sad woman, but they couldn't see the depths of her despair. Her last night on earth was a carefully orchestrated series of goodbyes. She went to the theater with friends, then to a glamorous supper club. Her final stop was a small party hosted by the artist Isamu Noguchi. She arrived late, wearing a stunning black velvet dress adorned with a corsage of small yellow roses. She was reportedly in good spirits, laughing and talking with friends. At around 1 a.m. she left, saying she had to meet other people. Noguchi would later recall that her final words to him were, "Well, that's all. Good night." She returned to her lavish one-room apartment on the 16th floor of the Hampshire House, a luxury building overlooking Central Park. There, she sat down and wrote a series of farewell letters. One was to her lawyer dealing with her debts. The other, to a friend, spoke of her despair and her decision. Then, just before dawn, on October 21st, 1938, Dorothy Hale, dressed in her beautiful black gown, stepped out onto her balcony and jumped. The story could have ended there, a tragic footnote in the society pages. But Dorothy's death was to have an explosive and controversial afterlife, thanks to the two most powerful women in her life, her friend Claire Booth Luce and the revolutionary Mexican artist Frida Kahlo. Devastated by Dorothy's suicide, Luce was consumed with guilt. She had been one of Dorothy's closest confidants and patrons, but she had also delivered the final harsh ultimatum. Wanting to create a beautiful tribute, Luce contacted Frida Kahlo, whom she had met in Paris. She commissioned Kahlo to paint a recuerdo, a remembrance portrait, of their beautiful friend so that she will not be forgotten. Luce envisioned a traditional, ethereal portrait of Dorothy in all her glory. She sent Kahlo $400 for the commission. What she received nearly a year later was not a sentimental memorial. It was a bombshell. Frida Kahlo, an artist who channeled her own immense physical and emotional pain into her work, had no interest in painting a sanitized, society-approved portrait. She was a communist, deeply suspicious of the wealthy, capitalist world that Luce and Hale inhabited. Instead of a recuerdo, she painted a Mexican folk art form known as an ex voto or retablo, a narrative painting that depicts a tragedy from which a person was saved by a saint. But in Kahlo's version, there was no saint and there was no salvation. The painting was shockingly graphic. It depicted Dorothy's death in a grim cinematic sequence. At the top, there is Dorothy, alive and beautiful on her balcony. Below that, she is shown midair, a ghostly figure tumbling through the night sky. And at the bottom, her broken body lies on the bloody pavement, one eye eerily open. Kahlo even inscribed the grim details at the bottom of the painting, like a news report. In the city of New York on the 21st day of the month of October 1938, at 6 o'clock in the morning, Mrs. Dorothy Hale committed suicide by throwing herself out of a very high window of the Hampshire House building. When Claire Booth Luce first saw the painting, she was overcome with horror and rage. She felt it was a grotesque betrayal, a cruel and macabre mockery of her friend's memory. Her first impulse was to destroy it. She famously said, "I wanted to commit suicide myself." She was so appalled that she had a friend, the sculptor Isamu Noguchi, paint out her own name from the inscription, where Kahlo had originally credited her with the commission. The ensuing debate over the painting has raged for decades. Was Kahlo's act one of calculated cruelty? Did she despise Dorothy and her privileged world and use the commission to make a political statement? Or was it an act of radical empathy? Perhaps Kahlo, a woman who lived with constant pain, was the only one who could truly see past Dorothy's glamorous facade. Maybe she was trying to depict the raw, violent truth of a woman's despair, refusing to let it be prettified and forgotten. She wasn't painting the society myth. She was painting the broken body and the terrible, lonely fall. Dorothy Hale's life is a story that exists almost entirely in the shadow of its tragic end. She is remembered not for the life she lived, but for the way she died, and for the shocking work of art that immortalized it. Her story is a powerful testament to the dark side of the American dream in an era of immense social pressure. She was a woman who performed her role perfectly, but who lacked the financial and emotional independence to survive when the curtain fell. Her ultimate significance is intrinsically linked to the painting that caused so much controversy. Claire Booth Luce wanted to remember her friend as a beautiful, flawless icon, a tragic heroine from a society novel. She wanted to control the narrative. But Frida Kahlo wrested that control away. She refused to paint a lie. In doing so, she gave Dorothy Hale a strange and powerful kind of immortality. She ensured that we would be forced to confront the brutal reality of her suffering, not just the glamorous mask she wore. The painting keeps Dorothy Hale's story alive, forcing us to look beyond the surface and ask unsettling questions about beauty, class, art, and a woman's place in the world. In the end, we are left with two portraits of Dorothy Hale. One is the memory her friends wanted to keep, a lovely, gentle, and beautiful woman, forever poised and perfect. The other is Kahlo's vision, a body in freefall, a bloody and tragic end. The truth of who Dorothy Hale was lies somewhere in the haunting space between them. She was a woman who spent her life creating a beautiful illusion. It was her tragedy that she could not survive when the illusion faded, and it is her legacy that a great artist refused to let the illusion be her final word, instead showing the world the terrible, painful truth of her fall.